Hello, I'm Helen from Journal with Purpose and welcome to my latest YouTube video. Today I'm going to be sharing a tutorial of where I'm going to be using watercolour through a stencil, as this is something I've been asked to share. So I'm going to recommend, if you follow along with me, to try and find a stencil with quite big spaces in it. The more fine and intricate your stencil, the more difficult it's going to be. And you're not going to get a perfect result with this, but you get a really lovely loose watercolour effect. So I'm using a Tim Holtz collection stencil, and I love the flowers on this. And the journal that I'm going to be working in is this Flex book, which I was sent by Colt Pens. Really enjoying working in this. So I think this time, because last time I did this, I did my stenciling across a couple of pages, but I think I might just do one main one on this page. And I'm going to use some of the Prima Marketing Tropicals watercolour paints. And I think I'm going to go for a few different shades. So I'm going to start off by just mixing some watercolour up in my palette. And I'm going to add a reasonable amount of water, but not too much, because we don't want it to be, I guess, a really, really diluted wash. But hopefully we'll get away with quite a bit. So I think I'm going to go for perhaps a blue, a pink and a purple maybe. So yeah, I'm just going to get these mixed up in my palette. And I'll probably make sure that I've got just a little bit more paint than water in there. So I'll just keep adding a bit more pigment back into that palette. So that's probably about right for the first colour, so I'll just mix another couple up. Now that my paints are mixed, I'm going to start applying watercolour through my stencil, and I'm trying to hold this down fairly firmly onto my page. And the way that I've been doing it that's been working well is kind of dragging that paint over the top of the stencil and then into the kind of gap bit, so that I'm not pressing, hopefully, underneath the stencil. So it takes a little while because you have to keep moving your arm around. And any places where the stencil's lifting up a little bit, which it is here, is where you've kind of got the biggest chance of paint going underneath that stencil. But I guess my other tip is to not overload your brush with too much paint. Okay, some of it is still going to flow. We are using a wet medium, but hopefully not too much. So we're still going to get those lovely loose shapes. So I'm going to use this first colour about a third of the way down the stencil. And so just keep moving your arm around a bit if you can, so that you're not pressing up over the top of the sort of underneath the stencil. So I'm going to do a little bit more in this colour. I love using stencils, one of my favourite types of products to use, so I really like to find lots of different ways to be able to use them. Okay, I'm now going to switch colours and move on to the pink. And again, I'm not putting too much paint, I'm just really covering the tip of my brush. I'm gently moving my fingers down to try and keep this stencil pressed as close to the page as I can. But as long as you're not expecting your stenciling to come out too perfect, I think this is a really lovely way to be able to get some different use out of your stencils. And you can of course always draw around them and get some really lovely shapes onto your page that way. So again, just gently moving my fingers down the page and trying to remember to just keep pulling it away from the stencil and not overloading your brush. Now, the first time I did this, I made a really silly mistake. I decided that before pulling the stencil up, I wanted to try and dry the paint. So I actually used a heat tool, which if I'd thought through, I would have realised wasn't a good idea, because it actually really started to melt kind of the stencil. It certainly warped it to the point where it would now be really difficult to use. So yeah, I definitely wouldn't advise that. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Okay, so I'm just going to carry on now. I've got probably about as much of that pink down as I want. So I'm going to carry on and just add my purple paint on the page. Okay, so I've now got all of the paint through that stencil. And what I'm going to do is carefully ease the pressure off and try and lift it up without smudging, which I've done, and I'm really pleased with how that's looking. So if it's still a bit wet at the bottom, you could just leave your stencil in place and leave it to try and dry for a few minutes, but then lift that stencil up, say, and try not to smudge it if you can. And I think what I'm also going to do while I'm here is just add a few little splashes of paint over my page. So I hope you've enjoyed watching how I put watercolour through a stencil. When I posted on Instagram, one of the last ones where I'd done that just as a photo, I had lots of requests of asking how to do that. So if you're one of those, I hope that's helped. And I'm just going to get this page nicely dried off. Okay, the next thing I think I'm going to do to this page is add a quote. So I cut out each of the ones that I release on my Patreon printables each month. So I'm just having a look through which of these I fancy. I'm quite liking actually the thought of messy but perfect. I think that ties in rather nicely with the loose watercolour. So I'm just going to use a bit of Pritt Stick to glue that onto my page. I have to excuse me, I'm rather croaky at the moment for some reason. Okay. Yeah, in fact I think I might off-centre that. And for the page on the right, I'm going to add some more decoration, and I'm going to use this washi tape from London Gifties. I thought the colours of this would tie in really nicely with the watercolour I've used on the other page. And I'm just going to trim those corners off. And as always, I'll try and leave links to any products that I've used or mentioned down below, just in case there's anything that you're particularly looking for. And then I've also been sent this really large roll of pet tape from London Gifties, and I had my eye on her because again I think those colours are going to tie in beautifully. I'm just going to cut her out. I really enjoy using these because they're on a transparent background. It means that whatever kind of paper you want to put them on, it's going to look like it was already part of the page, which I really like that look. I think I'm going to add her in the centre of this page. And then I want to bring a little bit of boldness. So I want to add a frame. So I'm going to use my Staedtler Mars Lumograph black pencil in 6B, and I'm going to add a frame around both of these pages. It'll also help bring the two of them together. And I'm also going to add a frame around this quote as well to help it stand out on my page. And then I'm going to add my date and quote, and for this I'm using a Tombow Fudenosuke brush pen with a firm nib. So I really like that quote. I thought it fitted in perfectly with the page, but also just an acknowledgement. I think that often we perhaps feel our own lives in whatever way quite messy and maybe not that controlled, especially if you look on social media and how other things are presented. So I thought that was a really nice reminder to add on there. So I'm now going to add my journal writing, and for this I'm going to use my beautiful fountain pen from Stanford Pen Studio. Okay, that's my journal writing all complete. I'm really happy with how these pages came together, and I really hope you enjoyed seeing how I use watercolour through a stencil. As always, I want to say a massive thank you to everybody who's joined me over on Patreon. Thank you ever so much for watching. I hope you're doing really well. I look forward to speaking with you really soon in my next video.